Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Well Versed, a podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about something that I don't know necessarily a lot about, looking forward to learning more about. But today we're talking about, I don't know if I have a good word for these, but almost Christian faiths. Let's call them that. Stuff like Mormonism, the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm sure there's others that I'm failing to come up with right now. But today we're talking about them because there seems to be, for myself growing up, and even a little bit now, some confusion about what these are, why someone might refer to them as almost Christian. Are they Christian faiths? Is that just like another denomination of Christianity, the way we would talk about Catholicism or something like that? Are they whole separate religions altogether? I don't know if you can shed some more light on these.
Sure. I think it's really important to sort of start at the really broad level view, and
right.
So we get a picture of where we're at and what
Let's
we're
define
talking
some terms
about.
almost.
Yeah. Because at the sort of like what we're not talking about, of course, is different Christian denominations, right? So we're not talking about Protestant versus Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. Like those would all be considered. Well, I know one of them calls themselves the Orthodox Church, but in a sort of generic way, we'd say those are all Orthodox Christian. Right? And then there's another distinction, which is there are religions that are, of course, completely unconnected to Christianity in any way, shape, or form, right? I mean, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, right? Which have like a whole separate tradition and aren't connected to the Christian tradition. Then we have, and this is still not what we're talking about today.
Right.
There's the Abrahamic faiths. Mm-hmm. So there's the three big Abrahamic faiths, of course, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Right.
All three of those faiths worship the same God, at least in theory, right? That's a whole other conversation, but they all theoretically worship the God of Abraham, right? And even though they have different conceptions of that God, and that's a different conversation. But no Muslim thinks of themselves as a Christian, and no Christian would think of themselves as a Muslim, and the same with Jews. So all the way around, right?
We share certain scriptures,
right?
Right,
and we share certain ideas and certain there's a certain tradition that they all come from, but they are all very distinct from one another, and there's no overlap between them.
No one's telling themselves that it's all Judaism, it's all Christianity, it's all Islam.
Right. At least for the most part, nobody's saying.
Sure.
Now, what we are talking about are these faiths or religions that, rather than being part of the Abrahamic tradition, they are explicitly Christian branches. So they come out of the Christian church rather than coming alongside it or being completely separated from it. So Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Adventists, some other groups like that, where they would claim Christianity as their parent label, but that they are sort of a subset within it.
Right.
And that's what we're talking about.
Right. And almost kind of clarify some things here. And again, I just want to say this first and foremost. I am coming from a place of relative ignorance. I don't claim to know all the things that I'm saying for certain on the subject. I've done some research. I'd like to think that I have looked up some accurate information, but if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Please correct me. Please correct me. But would you say that members of these faiths would think of themselves as just like a separate denomination from you or I? Would they say that the divide between us would be denominational, whereas I'm saying no, there's a heretical line that's been crossed?
So I don't know the answer to that in all cases.
Okay.
I think it does differ.
Sure.
I think, for example, Mormonism has become more and more its own thing over the years, and so I think while there are still plenty of Mormons who might think of themselves as just like Christians,
right.
I do think there's more Mormons who don't think that way, nowadays at least. Whereas for Jehovah's Witnesses, for Adventists, for some of these other groups that are even smaller than that, their tendency probably is to hold the Christian mantle and say that they are Christians, and that the only difference is, some denominational beliefs.
Sure. But I mean, us as Christians, we can make the statement, at least with some certainty, that and we maybe even get into some of these things, but their theology is incompatible. They cross some hard lines, I guess.
Right.
Like, I might look at some of the different denominations and say, well, we might disagree on certain things, but there are some lines that have not been crossed. We agree on some certain irrefutable truths, whereas these other faiths make a point to cross these lines.
Yeah. So I just want to bring in an image that has really helped me out, that came from one of my professors in seminary when he was talking about like orthodoxy and being proper doctrinal.
Sure.
And so his what he said was, we tend to think of like orthodox, the orthodox position, the correct position. We tend to think of it like a dartboard, that there's like a right position, and that everything else kind of circles around it as more or less right.
Sure.
But he said the better way to think of it historically is that orthodoxy, that proper theology is more like a field goal stand. That it's like you have to kick the ball through the uprights.
Sure.
But there's a lot of, if you're right inside the border, it still counts for 3 points, just like if you're right down the middle.
Right.
That all of it is and it's really just about making sure you're not outside of the post.
Right. It's not like a sliding scale of like how close you are to the truth.
Right.
There's a zone that could be deemed as truth.
Right.
And there are clear lines.
That it's less about defining the exact right position and more about defining where the boundaries are.
Gotcha.
And the reason I bring all this up is because in each of these cases, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, many of these others, there are places where most Orthodox Christians believe that those groups have gone outside the barriers. They've missed the field goal kick at some point in one of their doctrines or their beliefs or their behaviors.
Sure. Now, out of curiosity, I know I have my own answer, but is there a reason you think it's important that we even talk about this? Right? Like, why even give these almost Christian faiths, I call them, if that's offensive, I hope not. But like, why bring this up? Why do you think this is worth talking about?
I think it's worth talking about for 2 reasons.
Okay.
Number one is from an inward sense, I think it's important as Christians for us to know sort of be able to understand there are boundaries to orthodoxy, right? And be able to say, okay, I do understand where those groups have gone off track.
Sure.
And on a similar level, still inwardly, I think understanding what makes Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or whoever, what makes them go wrong is also a place where we can be sensitive and be aware of differences between our faiths and not just sort of try to paper over differences.
Right.
So that's the inward, and then outward facing reason would be those groups often, as we've said, they often claim Christianity, whether they call themselves Christian or they claim Christianity as their background, and so to be able to say to those who are not either Christian or Mormon or Christian or Jehovah's, right? Somebody who's looking at both groups from the outside, if they say, well, I don't see what's the difference, they say they're Christians, we can be able to say, well, actually, here is what's different, and here's why what they're doing is not what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's my best reasoning for why it's worth talking about it.
Yeah, and I mean, so I kind of want to link onto that. I have like 3 kind of examples. Like, I don't know if I'll go into all of them, but I do think that because there is like a claiming of being Christian, that a lot of times Christians do maybe get their truth from the wrong place and don't necessarily have the skills to identify it, right? It's almost like there's like an insidious nature to truth. You don't know where it's coming from. And I think back to when I was in youth group, there was a student who brought with him a Bible to camp. And unbeknownst to him, it was actually a Jehovah's Witness Bible. But he had no way of knowing that it was of their translation. It looked just like any old Bible. If you weren't intentional about checking the translation of your Bible, you would have had no clue. But it was almost kind of a cool learning experience because his translation differed on some key verses of that camp in such a way that it was like, hold up, like what's going on? Like my Bible is claiming something the rest of you are claiming is different. Like what's going on? And I can't remember like what it was exactly, but I know it was a reframing of the Trinity to not exist, right?
Right.
As I know at some point during that camp there was a lesson about the Trinity, and when that student opened up his Bible to kind of read along, he was like, hold up, my Bible is not making a case for the Trinity. What's going on?
Yeah.
So that'd be like my first point to bring this up is A, to clue people in like, hey, it's always important to like check your scripture. It's always important to check where your truth is coming from.
Yeah.
But no, like there are people who I don't think necessarily maliciously are handing off a truth that's not true, right?
Yeah.
And and I also too, kind of in the same vein, I work in a lot of faith clubs, and I have students who are awesome students. Their faith is on fire. They are responsible. They are great leaders. They give me a lot of hope for ministry when I see young ministers like them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like in their fervor to, get discipled and whatnot, I have seen them get discipled by other groups like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. Again, not maliciously, like they were like kidnapped or like swindled into this, or like swindled into it. But a lot of people just don't have the discernment necessary to understand like where their information is coming from and some of the like doctrinal divides that we have.
Yeah.
But so to kind of like go into, that was my first big question. But to go into the next question, I suppose. How do you think Christians ought to behave or think about these other religions, right? I know we still love them.
Right.
We still pray fervently that they experience truth as we hope to experience truth. But I guess more specific, I don't know if you have a good take on that.
I think, so the first thing I'll say is, as much as to those of us who are practicing Christians, some of the things about Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness can seem a little out there and weird and wild. Like, I do think it's still beneficial to approach every other religion, and especially a person who practices another religion, with openness.
Right.
Which is not to say that you should go in thinking like, oh, they might be right and I'm wrong.
Right.
Although that's not a bad position to take in general in life, as long as you can ground yourself in truth, But being able to be open and not come in closed off and say I'm here to make sure that you know that I'm right and you're wrong.
Right. Just for life, approach everyone with an agenda for love. Right.
Yeah. Right. So that I think is the most important first thing. But then beyond that, I do think it's really important that we are aware of the ways in which those other faiths, I'm just going to call them other religions at this point, the way that those other religions, sort of use Christianity in not quite accurate ways.
Right.
And being able to approach people who are Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or whatever, again, doing it with openness, doing it with love, but being able to, if they say, hey, you and I were one and the same, to be able to say, I disagree with that, and here's why.
Right.
I think that is important because for a lot of people, especially people who are just regular, everyday practicing Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, they probably don't know better. I don't think we should apply malicious intent to your average everyday Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or Adventist or whichever other group, right? In general, people,
just like we want to disciple people and preach and minister and share what you and I are betting our lives that what we think Christianity is true, right?
Yeah.
And we spend our whole lives pursuing making that truth better. So I can't fault them for doing the same.
Right.
But ideally, we should be able to have a good case for why we would argue we are more accurate.
Yeah. So I think it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile knowing about those religions, both so you can understand and empathize with people who are within those religions, and so that you can understand how they differ from Christianity and be able to speak to those things. Mm-hmm. And as long as all that is done with love as sort of the primary, starting point, that I think it's possible to have really good dialogue and to have, an important conversation with people.
Yeah, and I think you hit the hammer on the head. I just kind of want to add to that, is don't walk into that conversation saying like, oh, well, I watched a video by Grant and Tony saying they were different religions, so that they must be. Like,
Right.
well, yes, you can trust us when we say that, but do the research, right?
Yeah.
Like even in the limited research that I did, I was able to come with some pretty solid bullet points as to like what our differences are. I was able to learn that like one of like the like key aspects of Mormonism, right, is the revelation unto Joseph Smith, right?
Right.
At least according to the brief research I did, there was a distinction that Mormons hold Joseph Smith's revelation to be the most true document.
Yeah.
Now, while they did say more true than the Bible, I would assume most true implies that. Now, that's where I would say, like, well, how come his revelation is more true than the Bible? What makes his more accurate, right? But anyways, yeah, I would just say there is value in doing that research. It'll teach you a lot about your own faith.
Yeah.
It'll help you reaffirm a lot of loose concepts in your head that you hear all the time on Sunday, but haven't actually had to wrestle with. So that's a good thing. But yeah, I mean, approaching those conversations in love is really how we should. I think if that's your operating procedure in all conversations, then you're in a pretty good spot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think you brought up a good thing that we should probably talk about for just a moment, which is neither one of us is experts on these other religions, but I do think it would be helpful to just like do a brief outline of what these religions are that we're talking about.
Right.
So Mormonism started in the 1800s by Joseph Smith. He claims to have, discovered or been presented books, the Book of Mormon from the angel Moroni. So in the Mormon faith, there is sort of a superseding text, right? There's the Book of Mormon, which is, as you said, more true than the Bible.
Right.
Now again, they still include the Bible in their group of their holy texts,
right?
But the Book of Mormon supersedes it. And some of the things that are in there, Mormons believe that God was once a man, and
right.
that we have the opportunity to become gods in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And Mormons definitely don't believe in the Trinity.
Right.
They don't believe, they believe in Jesus and God as separate gods.
Mm-hmm.
They do believe in the Spirit, but like not as a third part of the Trinity.
Right. As an impersonal force, I believe I've seen.
Yeah. So those are some things about. That's just a really brief overview for Mormonism, and really briefly, Jehovah's Witness began actually as the followers of someone who claimed they had figured out the date of of Jesus' second coming.
Mm.
So they thought they'd figured out the day of the apocalypse, and then it turned out they were wrong. The person who came up with this, whose name I am not remembering at the moment, but they sort of just came up with a bunch of excuses instead.
Sure.
For how it actually did happen,
Mm-hmm.
instead of saying, "Oh no, it just didn't happen. I was wrong."
Sure.
And so that sort of led to the Jehovah's Witness faith over time. So sort of a long drawn out. How do you get from? But so again, one of the reasons why it's true with Mormonism, because for Mormons, the connection from Mormonism to Jesus, even though Mormons have their own book, is that for Mormons, the Book of Mormon is the words of Jesus to people in America. That Jesus came to North America after dying on the cross in Israel.
Right.
So that's the connection to Christianity with Mormonism, is through Jesus. But this idea that Jesus went to America. For Jehovah's Witness, it's even more direct, because it's literally somebody was looking at the Bible
Right.
and thought they had figured out the end times date.
Mm-hmm.
And then when that didn't come true, they just sort of had to figure out how to keep their followers going, and sort of came up with he actually did come back, but it was just, he was invisible, and it was, X, Y, and Z. And
right. And again, I really don't want to speak too much out of like an area that I'm ignorant in.
yeah.
I know, didn't he also like a muddy history of like, I've heard stuff along the lines of like there's documentation of him saying like, oh, I can make a religion make a ton of money, or
I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I mean, Joseph Smith was pretty famously a con man before starting Mormonism.
Yeah, I'm going to drop that point because I'm not too certain. I don't want to make a fool of myself. But I do know that one, I guess, point thing for the Jehovah's Witnesses, not point for them, but point I think worth bringing up with them also is that they have their own translation of the Bible,
right?
Which I'm told is just actively incorrect readings of the Greek.
It does. They have their, I think it's the New World Translation or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And it is, it's fascinating to see the verses where they just rewrite the verse to suit their understanding.
Right, I believe now it's coming back to me vaguely. They had one of their translators in court, and they asked him if he could read Greek. He was unable to. Again, I'm reaching on like distant conversation with the previous youth pastor here, but well, I mean, fair enough. That was a good summation, though. And I think almost one of the last questions I want to touch on though is, let's say we meet a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness, an Adventist, or any number of people with any religion.
Yeah.
Really. Well, I guess specifically these, and they're claiming to be Christian. We've kind of touched on a lot of the key differences, but I don't know. Do you think that there is a... What do you think, I guess, the strategy is? Should we walk into those conversations trying to like win them back to the truth, or do you think that is our place as Christians? Do you have any thoughts on that one?
I'm not sure you can say overall. I think it's going to depend on the individual person.
Right.
But I suppose that goes back to the first step is you need to get to know a person.
Right.
Don't go into a conversation with a stranger.
Right.
Expecting to get them to change their religion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes it'll work, maybe, but more often what you need to do is you need to build a relationship with somebody and help them see slowly over time the little flaws in what they believe, or the truth of what you believe, and maybe a little bit of both. But mostly it's going to be through character. It's not going to be through who's right or who's wrong. It's going to be did you show them the love of Jesus, and combine that with the truth, and over time you have a potential formula for making change. Yeah,
I think it's worth pointing out too that if your attempt at like convincing someone else to send this video and just drop this video in a text message and leave it, it's not going to be very effective, right?
No, we're not clearly talking to people who are Mormon or Jehovah's Witness in this video.
Right.
There's an assumption that you, the viewer, are likely a Christian or Christian leaning in your reviews.
Sure.
There's some things we probably would not have said if we were trying to reach Mormons or Jehovah's Witness in this video.
Or maybe not even wouldn't have said, but we would have just probably taken this conversation in a different direction.
Yes.
Because really the chief point of this video was to help educate people, help key you guys into these things exist. I go back to the student who brought a Jehovah's Witness Bible translation to camp. I don't think anyone did anything like malicious there, or whoever got him the Bible. He might have been given the Bible by a Christian who didn't think to check the translation first, right?
Yeah.
But it's just important that we are aware of where our information comes from and able to help identify some of the more common, because there's plenty of other things we haven't mentioned, but some of the more common mistruths that are being shared.
Yeah.
And I will say on the last point too, is as Christians, we don't need to feel the need to like give ground that there are differences between us, right?
Right.
I don't need to go to my Mormon friends or my Jehovah's Witness friends and say like, oh yeah, we're all Christians for the sake of that relationship, for the sake of like not ruffling any feathers. I think you can have a loving like conversation and say like, hey, I think there is a difference between our faiths. Let's catch a coffee sometime and talk it through. I'd love to hear what you. Yeah. I'd love to hear more about your faith, right?
Ultimately, though, it comes down to having that conversation lovingly rather than doing it in a place of judgment or like holier than thou or I'm right and you're wrong,
Right. Ultimately, you should count yourself, if you meet someone who comes from a different faith than you, assuming you're a Christian, you should count yourself lucky, not better, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we are extremely fortunate to have been able to live in the circumstances that got us to where we are. And ideally praying that God uses us in the circumstances to get them to Christianity one day too.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think we have done a good job hitting everything we want to hit. Grant, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts on this video before we pray out.
I think we covered it.
Sweet. Well, in that case, I would love to go ahead and pray us out of this video. Dear Father, Lord God, Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity to gather here, Lord. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to be able to have this conversation, God. Lord, I want to lift up both Grant and I, everyone watching, everyone not watching, Lord, that we would be able to move forward in all of our conversations, all of our relationships, all of our motives in love, Father. Lord, I pray that we have a foundation of wanting people to experience the joy of knowing you, Father. Lord, I pray that as we try to grow closer to you, as we try to learn more about you, Lord, that we would be cautious in how we consume information, Lord. That we would be skilled at verifying everything, Lord. Paul said that a certain body of believers were blessed because they verified everything he had said in the scriptures first, Father, and I pray that we would carry a similar spirit within all of us in all things, Father, whether that is differentiating between other faiths and our own God, or even just in the various circumstances that we find ourselves in life. Father, I thank you for all of our viewers and all the people who are not viewing. Lord, I pray for everyone who has the truth. God, I thank you for them, Lord. And I thank you for the work you're doing on the hearts of everyone who is approaching the truth. Lord, I say all these things in your Son's name. Amen. Thanks, guys.